Welcome everybody to GoLocal Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. Before we go to the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia, Jennifer Lawless, a little breaking news that GoLocal is just getting out. An unusual situation. While much of downtown Providence was being vandalized and looted last Tuesday morning, the owner-operator of Fortnight Wine Bar in downtown Providence on the corner of Way Bossett and Dorrance Street was being arrested along with another woman for spray painting, graffitiing City Hall in Providence with the initials ACAB, which is the acronym for All Cops Are Bastards. That story is now live on GoLocal. Take a look at it, a strange twist in a night of destruction that vandalized many, many small businesses across Providence. You'd not expect another small business operator to be involved with the activities, but this is a strange, strange time. Let's go to Professor Lawless. Professor, how are you?
I'm fine, how are you?
You know, there's never a dull moment in the last 100 days. So as a news organization, there is literally no shortage of news, that's for sure. Let's go to the White House. What's going on in the White House?
I don't know, and I don't know who is keeping track of the president. Clearly no one has his phone. I mean, if we look at the last week, it's really remarkable. You have a situation where the president decides that he's going to bring in the National Guard against U.S. citizens just peacefully protesting. You have him now send out a tweet suggesting that one of the protesters who was hurt by police officers was a 75-year-old man who actually fell harder than he was pushed, according to the president. You have time and time again references to the fact that he's going to start his rallies again. If we can have these protests, then social distancing is not a problem. Then you can have these rallies. He's going around to these southern states asking who can have a convention for the Republicans with no restrictions. I mean, it's just one thing after another that flies in the face of what we would typically expect a White House and administration to do amid dual crises. So, and that's just, and in addition to that, we haven't heard from the coronavirus task force in quite some time.
We haven't. Dr. Fauci did go on Washington, D.C. radio and said, listen, I strongly support protest and think it's a critical part of the democracy, but I am concerned about the potential spread of the virus and it enhancing the so-called second wave. Did anyone hear that message amongst the chaos of the weekend?
I think very little, because the Surgeon General said something very similar. I think that message was overshadowed by the protests. I also think that the World Health Organization coming out yesterday and saying that it's unclear whether asymptomatic spread is a really big problem winds up mitigating or diluting some of Fauci's message as well. And at this point, when we are still amid a lot of uncertainty, anything that can dilute or mitigate a message like that has the potential to be a real can of worms.
We've got a number of big states, especially in the Northeast, who got hit hard by the coronavirus. Their number of cases are decreasing, Rhode Island included, although the deaths in Rhode Island still are a disturbing number. But the number of new cases, the number of ICUs, the number of hospitalizations have declined dramatically. That's great news here. But you're seeing a number of states around the country, significant states, Texas, Utah, I believe North Carolina, in which the number of new cases are going up significantly.
California, too, even though they sort of were parallel to the Northeast in terms of the measures they were taking to mitigate the virus. And so these overall numbers look like we're plateauing, but in large part, that's because in the Northeast and in New England, we are seeing substantial declines because these states have been closed for a really long time. I think that over the course of the next couple of weeks, we'll learn a lot more because yesterday, New York City reopened. So Manhattan and the other 4 boroughs opened, and we'll see what happens. That coupled with all of the protests nationwide, especially in large cities, will, I think, tell us quite a bit about whether these reopening measures are too soon and too much.
Let's also go back to Washington. The jobs numbers were spectacularly good, shocking absolutely everyone, and there is some data issue The New York Times has a piece that was not a malicious or a manipulated data issue. It's just the way the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts together its data historically. But 2.5 million new jobs was a shocker, and it does play into Donald Trump's argument that he's good at building an economy.
It does. I mean, I would say a couple of things. The first is even with the error in the coding of some of these jobs, there still would have been a net increase. So the error doesn't account for the total. Part of this, though, keep in mind, is that people were encouraged to file for unemployment originally. So the minute that their businesses were closed or the minute that their jobs were being halted, they were encouraged to file. And we knew that there were going to be short-term unemployment losses if all went well, because these companies would ultimately reopen. And so we're beginning to see that kind of reopening. So, it's not that it's surprising that it happened that quickly, but I think part of the reason that it's surprising that it happened that quickly is because we didn't expect the economy to be reopening this quickly and so many states to be saying, okay, let's just go for it. So, I mean, it might be a good thing economically, but I worry that it also might be highlighting that we're moving a little bit too fast. We'll see. We'll see what the case numbers look like. And we'll also see next month, when we have new Department of Labor data, whether these numbers held or continue to improve.
Joe Biden has gone low profile, maybe a little higher profile in the past few days, but for the most part, he's allowing this race to be dictated presently by the negative reaction to Trump's decisions, and allowing his lead to increase really as a referendum of Donald Trump, not a referendum on Joe Biden.
Right. I think it's a smart strategy for two reasons. The first is that Donald Trump's approval numbers, now we have finally some polling evidence to suggest that they've fallen below 40%. It's hard to imagine any sort of reelection with an approval at less than 40% and almost 3/4 of the nation believing that the country's heading down the wrong track. So everything that Donald Trump can do to help Joe Biden wants Donald Trump to do. In addition to that, we do see Joe Biden venturing out a little bit more and really providing a clear juxtaposition to voters. So it's not that he's out there talking so much about the nuances of public policy. It's really pitting himself against Donald Trump in terms of personality and empathy and the ability to lead amid a time of crisis. And I don't think you need a photo opportunity to do that on a daily basis. In some ways, the photos and the video clips that we have been so effective that it behooves Joe Biden to just have those continue to show until there's something new. The other thing I would note that's pretty important here is that Joe Biden is, in a lot of ways, beginning to act like he's president, like he's acting like he's the alternative. He's the one that's also now trying to soothe the nation. He's the one that is meeting with families of victims. And that's not something that candidates would typically do.
Yeah, no, it's been a smart strategy for the past 10 days. He does run the risk, though, of not defining himself. And as we all know, Republicans are very good on the attack game as we get closer to the election. And Joe Biden was a United States Senator for 30 years, and he's got 30 years of votes that, in retrospect, do not align with what the reality of politics are today. Does he have a vulnerability of when the Republicans ratchet that up in October, late September and into October, that they completely redefine Joe Biden?
Well, I think those are the kinds of things that made him vulnerable in a primary. When we get to the general election, there's not going to be a lot of crossing party lines on either side of the aisle. It's really just a matter of, are people so put off by their nominee that they're not going to turn out to vote at all? And although there might be a small group of people that feel that way about Biden and his previous votes, although he's done a pretty good job being very honest and saying, look, I don't think that way anymore. This isn't a matter of flip-flopping. This is a matter of evolution. It's hard to imagine that their attitudes about Donald Trump don't sufficiently motivate them to say, you know what, I'm going to suck it up and I'm going to vote. The other thing that I would note, and we don't know how deep this is going to go, is that some high-profile Republicans are being pretty vocal about their views of Donald Trump and their concerns about voting for him again as well. So this is not only Colin Powell, for whom it's not new. He endorsed and supported Hillary Clinton in 2016. But George W. Bush saying that they're not going to vote for Donald Trump. Now, we know also that they didn't vote for Trump in 2016, but that was because of how horrible he was to Jeb Bush. This is not about that anymore. We have Mitt Romney marching to the White House with a group chanting Black Lives Matter. We know that Donald Trump has no love for Mitt Romney, but Mitt Romney was the Republican Party's presidential nominee not that long ago. So as more and more high-profile Republicans begin to voice not only that they're troubled by Donald Trump, but that their behavior is going to reflect that they won't cast a vote for him, that also helps Joe Biden. Even if they don't vote for Joe Biden, it's a lot of these top dogs telling Republican voters that it's okay not to vote for Donald Trump.
I will point out that one smart person told me the other day, going back to Mitt Romney's run for the United States Senate in Massachusetts, that Mitt Romney has had more positions on more issues than any human being on the face of the earth, depending on which office he is running for and from which state he is running for. So just
I guess I've always had a little bit of a soft spot because he clearly wants to represent the people, whoever those people are.
Whatever state they're in, whether they're Olympians or Utah residents or Commonwealth of Massachusetts, he loves them all. Let's jump over to a potentially significant error by the Democrats of being associated with this idea of defunding the police. Now, Democrats have backed away from this. Joe Biden yesterday said, I'm not in favor of defunding the police. But this narrative is out there in a major United States city, Minneapolis. The city council, who has the votes, is voting in favor of defunding the Minneapolis Police Department. How dangerous an issue is that for Democrats?
It's not good for Democrats. I mean, it's the exact kind of line that can help Republicans. Even if it can't help Donald Trump, it can certainly help in some House and Senate races. It can also help at the local level where the police are, linked to the mayor and the city council. What's interesting here is that there are really no high-profile Democratic political leaders who are chanting defund the police. It's a matter of changing police practices. It's a matter of making sure that we're figuring out how to cut down on police brutality, to provide training that would avoid the kinds of horrible things that we've seen over the course of the last decade. But I don't know of anybody that's saying who's in a leadership position saying that this would be a good idea. But it's unclear that that really matters. And if that is now what the protesters want, if that, it started out that they wanted to ensure that the Minneapolis police officers were charged and that the charges were elevated, and they were. If they're moving toward a defund the police, then there's really going to be, I think, no end in sight for these protests, because there are not going to be that many cities that follow suit. And there certainly are not going to be that many high-level elected officials who get on board.
Yeah, and the only analogy I can think of is the 1972 election, in which Richard Nixon became the law and order candidate opposite the protesters of both the Vietnam War and other significant issues around the country. Richard Nixon in that race won 49 out of 50 states. McGovern only won Massachusetts in 17 electoral votes, the biggest landslide in history. While that doesn't look to be developing, we're only in June, and as we all know, by the week, everything in America seems to change.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is going to depend on whether we continue to see the kinds of protests that we've seen, and whether we continue to see police officers and law enforcement really listen to protesters, sometimes march with them, demonstrate clear respect for them. The more and more that happens, I think the more likely it is that there will be some sort of peaceful resolution at the end of this, which is one where there's no question that law enforcement around the country changes the way it does business and changes the way it operates, but that the cause will be for that, not necessarily to just defund the police. But as far as the Republicans are concerned, that's a great line and a great tagline for them to suggest that Democrats are soft on crime and, to run the 2020 version of the Willie Horton ad.
Yeah, absolutely. Buildings burning do not help Democrats. Protests may motivate their base, but burning buildings turns off too much of America to be able to support that as an activity, and they lose even some Democrats, middle-of-the-road Democrats, on that type of tactics. Let's go to where we are on legislation, whether or not we're going to see another big piece of legislation to bail out the states or to extend the federal unemployment $600 a week benefit. I think it was Lindsey Graham said, over my dead body are we extending that $600 a week compensation for those who are unemployed. Do you get a sense of where we are right now, or is everything up in the air due to all the other elements of society right now?
It seems to me that everything is up in the air, and actually the latest jobs report doesn't help the situation, because I think a lot of Republicans now can say, look, the economy is rebounding, it's coming back, we just have to wait and be patient. It's unfortunate, but it just takes time, and we're heading in that direction. If next month looks like that's not the case, then it's probably likely that they'll do something. But at this point, the economic numbers coupled with the additional uncertainty brought about by these protests gives the Republicans, I think, room to say, let's do nothing for right now.
Is Wall Street trying to weigh into this politically? Are they trying to say, A, we want Republicans, and B, we don't want another federal stimulus program? Because Wall Street is racing. It's up to almost 28,000. Every day is a 500-point gain, it seems like. And it seems to be a complete disassociation between what's going on in Providence, Rhode Island, or New York City, or anywhere else in the country.
Yeah, I don't understand it. I don't understand the economics of it. I don't understand the building blocks of it. You would be much better situated speaking to any economist than me on that front. But the disconnect does seem very striking. The other thing that I would remind people of, though, is that when election day comes, people are often voting based on what's in their own pocket. And often there's a pretty high correlation between broad national conditions and the way that they're individually faring. But if we see this disconnect and we sort of don't see how it's translating into Providence, Rhode Island, or New York City, or Washington, D.C., or any of these other places, chances are that voters don't either. And so even if Wall Street is trying to weigh in politically, at the end of the day, it's citizens who vote. And if they don't have money to put food on the table, that's going to be a problem.
I don't know if you saw the news we reported last night, but a millennial activist, he's a lawyer, he's on the chair of the Providence Board of License. I think he's 30 years old. Dylan Conley comes from a political family, but is a very activist, announced that he's going to challenge Jim Langevin in the congressional race, congressional primary for District 2. Jim Langevin's been in for 20 years. He has $1.2 million in his war chest. But is this the year that anyone can beat anyone anywhere?
No. So I was a 30-year-old who challenged Jim Langevin when he had $1.2 million in his war chest a long, long time ago. And I was struck in the article that you guys characterized him as a former moderate and now a liberal, and I take credit for that. But what I will say is that, this is a situation where I think Democrats are generally not particularly vulnerable, either in primaries or general elections, for two reasons. As far as the general election is concerned, so much of the sorting has already happened. There aren't that many members of Congress who represent districts that they shouldn't represent anymore based on party affiliation, which means that the fact that Democrats hold more seats than Republicans speaks to the fact that when you look at what these districts look like, more of them have a Democratic majority than not. As far as the primaries are concerned, primarying is a really good time when you think that the seat is a foregone conclusion and that the person is out of sync with what's going on in their party. So if Jim Langevin was consistently voting against Nancy Pelosi, or if he was making it more difficult for the Democrats to push forward the agenda that they were trying to push forward, or if the Republicans had control of the House and Jim Langevin was enabling them to get their agenda pushed forward, then he'd be vulnerable. But none of those things seems to be happening. So while it's true that he doesn't have a signature piece of legislation, I think given the political context in 2020, it's a really, really hard argument to make that you should throw out somebody just because they don't have a signature piece of legislation when the stakes across the board are so high on so many other levels. That said, I think it's great when people challenge incumbents, and I wish him a lot of luck.
Yeah, I think he's also not quite as clean a shot as his father is a power broker up at the State House. So I think that takes away a little bit of that pure outsider reformer argument that some others might have if going to challenge Jim Langevin. I will point out 4 years ago, Jim Langevin only got 55% of the vote in the general election. I always have thought that that seat is a little more vulnerable than others anticipate. But as you say, and I think you're correct, in a primary, that's a very tough place to beat him.
The one other thing I would note that I think is important too is that it's likely that Rhode Island will lose a seat next time around because of population. And so, you know, I would put Rhode Island in the most interesting category about what congressional politics looks like moving forward. And so it might be the case that this is not the time that people feel like it's even important to elect somebody new because there could be a very, very hotly contested race in 2022.
Jennifer Lawless, what do Rhode Islanders need to know about what's going on in the Capitol before we go?
So 2 things that I'm looking for this week. Basically, Val Demings has almost already been anointed vice president. So if you look at the news coverage, if you look at the articles that have been coming out, so I think that we're getting closer to knowing who the VP will be. And this week we might get more clues. And the other thing that I'm really, really interested in is the data that we get about asymptomatic spread. And we now have had a lot of states open for 2 weeks. And so we're going to be beginning to see more nuanced analyses, I think, of what these numbers look like, these corona case numbers look like in the states that have reopened. And that'll provide, I think, quite a bit of direction moving forward, because this is going to be where the rubber meets the road for some governors to say, all right, we're going to move ahead, and for others to say, I think we have to pull back on what we did.
Thank you so much. Always a great conversation when you join us. For everyone else this afternoon, Dr. Michael Fine will be on at 12 noon. We'll be talking about this issue of what the governor initiated yesterday and how it juxtaposes with what the World Health Organization has announced. The governor does not have a press conference on Tuesdays and Thursdays anymore. We do have some questions on this appearance of a conflict on the data and the science. For everybody else, thanks so much. To Professor Lawless, always appreciative. And everyone, please, please stay safe.